They were the gods and goddesses of the silver screen, but behind the glamour, some of Hollywood's biggest legends were hiding a secret right on top of their heads. Beneath the perfect curls and dashing pompadours were wigs, toupees, and hairpieces concealing bald spots, thinning scalps, and the harsh realities of aging in an industry obsessed with perfection. In an era where image was everything, the truth stayed locked in dressing rooms and makeup chairs. We're peeling back the curtain on the illusion that built an empire of stars. Stick around. The next name might just wreck your idea of movie magic. Frank Sinatra, the voice with the vanishing hairline. Frank Sinatra could command a room with just a glance and melt it with a single note. His voice was velvet, his swagger untouchable, and his presence undeniable. But behind that sharp fedora and polished charm was a quiet war being waged on his scalp. As early as his 40s, Sinatra began losing his hair, a fact he guarded more closely than his personal life. The public saw only the legend, few ever saw the toupee. In the tightly controlled image-making machine of mid-century showbiz, hair wasn't just vanity, it was survival. A thinning crown could signal weakness, age, or a fading career. And Sinatra, ever the perfectionist, wasn't about to let that happen. His custom-made toupees became as much a part of his uniform as his tailored tuxedos. Wigs crafted from real human hair were styled to perfection, sitting undetectably on his head through concerts, film shoots, and red carpet events. He even had backup pieces in case one failed under the heat of stage lights. But here's the twist. Sinatra didn't hide it from his inner circle. Friends knew, colleagues knew, but no one ever talked. That's the power of Sinatra. He could make silence part of the myth. And as the years passed, the toupee became a symbol not of vanity, but of mastery. A final, finishing touch on a man who knew the show must go on, even if the hair didn't. Lucille Ball, the red that wasn't real. Lucille Ball wasn't just a television icon. She was a cultural force, a trailblazer, and the fiery redhead who made America laugh. But here's the truth. That famous scarlet crown that became her signature? It was more illusion than inheritance. Lucille was born a brunette, and her transformation into the most recognizable redhead on the planet was a studio-engineered reinvention, one that came with a cost. The vivid copper color that defined Lucy Ricardo took hours of careful bleaching, coloring, and restyling. Over the years, the chemical strain left her natural hair weakened and fragile. That's when the wig stepped in, not as a gimmick, but as a necessity. Lucille had entire collections made to her exact specifications, color-matched, custom-styled, and indistinguishable from the real thing under hot studio lights. But Lucille didn't just wear wigs, she owned them. She used them not to hide, but to build a persona. Off-screen, she rotated through various hairpieces depending on the event, the look, the audience. It wasn't just about vanity, it was control. In an industry that prized youthful perfection, Lucille turned artificial hair into armor, maintaining her image long after the cameras stopped rolling. Behind every laugh track and punchline was a woman determined to stay in command of her own myth. Because for Lucille Ball, the secret wasn't that the hair was fake. The real story is how she made it more iconic than the truth ever could be. Cary Grant, suave to the scalp. Cary Grant didn't act like a gentleman, he defined one. Every movement was calculated elegance, every word dipped in mid-Atlantic charm. He was the man men wanted to be and women wanted to be, with a walking blueprint of charisma. But as with many great illusions, what appeared effortless was meticulously maintained. And one part of that maintenance was quietly secured atop his head. By the 1950s, Grant's famously smooth hairline had begun its quiet retreat. Underneath the sheen and symmetry was a carefully constructed hairpiece, not dramatic, not theatrical, but discreet. It didn't wave for attention, it whispered continuity. His toupees were masterworks of subtlety, crafted not to fool the world outright, but to preserve the image. The image mattered, not just to studios, but to Cary himself. Unlike others who lived in fear of being found out, Grant seemed almost indifferent to the truth. He reportedly joked about it in private, fully aware of the irony. The man known for authenticity on screen was also one of its most elegant fabrications. And that's what made it work. He didn't let the wig wear him, he wore it like a tuxedo. Seamless, stylish, unapologetic. Cary Grant didn't just act the part of the perfect man, he edited reality to match the fantasy. And in the process, he taught Hollywood a lesson it never forgot. The trick isn't hiding the illusion, it's making you believe it never mattered. Elizabeth Taylor, glamour reinvented strand by strand. Elizabeth Taylor didn't walk onto screens, she arrived like a jewel pulled from velvet. Her violet eyes, framed by lashes that looked almost painted on, became the stuff of legend. But it wasn't just her face that made her a goddess of the silver screen. It was the image, the aura, the total transformation. And yes, that included the hair, even when it wasn't her own. As a young starlet, Elizabeth's natural hair was thick and dark, a crown that seemed to reflect her strength. But as the decades passed, and with them the health struggles, surgeries, and media storms, her body paid the price of stardom. Her hair began to thin and at times fall out completely. Rather than retreat, she evolved. Taylor embraced wigs not just as cover, but as armor. She had dozens, lavish, theatrical, and unapologetically dramatic, each one matching her mood more than any mirror. Unlike some of her peers, she didn't hide behind them. She wore them, fully and fabulously. One day it was a raven cascade, the next a platinum halo. Her hairpieces became expressions of reinvention, a physical reflection of her inner resilience. To Elizabeth, a wig wasn't a mask, it was a declaration. I am still here, and I am still everything you dreamed I was. Because in the world of Elizabeth Taylor, reality was never the point, only the beauty you built from it. Humphrey Bogart, tough guy, fragile crown. Humphrey Bogart had a face like a fist and a voice that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. He was the ultimate tough guy, chain-smoking, hard-drinking, quick with a sneer or a smirk. In Casablanca, in The Maltese Falcon, he wasn't playing Bogart, he was Bogart. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. But behind the trench coat and fedora was a quieter truth, and it started right at the hairline. Bogart began losing his hair early. The studio couldn't allow its leading man, the very image of noir masculinity, to show signs of aging or vulnerability. And so, the toupee was introduced. It wasn't flashy, just functional. A shadow of hair designed to blend in, not stand out. Bogart wore it like a weapon, not to deceive, but to preserve his mythos. It became part of the costume, like the cigarette or the snub-nosed revolver. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Bogart never seemed interested in perfection. His toupee wasn't about vanity, it was about continuity. You didn't question it because you were too busy watching his eyes, his presence, the weight he carried into every room. In a strange way, the fakest part of him became invisible because everything else was so real. In a town built on fantasy, Bogart showed that you could still be authentic, even if your hair wasn't. Judy Garland, the weight beneath the wig. Judy Garland didn't just sing songs, she poured herself into them. Every note trembled with something raw and unmistakably human. She was America's sweetheart and its sorrow, wrapped in one fragile, luminous figure. But behind that voice, that smile, that cinematic magic, Judy carried burdens, some emotional, some physical, and sometimes even her hair couldn't hold the weight. The pressures of studio life started young for her. Endless reshoots, grueling schedules, and a cocktail of medications robbed her not only of peace, but of physical vitality. Her once thick hair began to thin under the constant strain. Studio stylists tried everything, dyes, rollers, chemicals, until eventually the damage was done. Wigs became the solution, not for glamour, but for restoration. To give the illusion that the girl behind Somewhere Over the Rainbow hadn't been changed by the storm. Garland didn't parade her wigs. She wore them out of necessity, and perhaps even pain. Each one styled to recall the innocence the industry refused to let her keep. They were delicate, carefully chosen, sometimes braided into headpieces that mimicked her younger self, a visual echo of the girl the world refused to let go of. The wigs weren't just cover, they were part of the performance. A way to step back into the fantasy, even when the real Judy was worn thin. Because for Garland, the show didn't go on because she was ready, it went on because it had to. John Wayne, the Duke's disappearing hairline. He rode across the screen like a force of nature, broad-shouldered, slow-talking, unshakably masculine. John Wayne wasn't just a man, he was an institution, the Duke, the symbol of American grit and cowboy grit. But even the toughest legends have soft spots, and Wayne's was sitting quietly under his 10-gallon hat. By the time his leading man status was cemented, John Wayne's hair had already begun its retreat. The desert sun may have weathered his skin, but it was age, and perhaps genetics, that took aim at his scalp. And in a Hollywood that prized eternal youth, even the most rugged star needed a little help. Enter the toupee. It wasn't something Wayne talked about. In fact, he went to great lengths to pretend it wasn't even there. On set, his hairpieces were so meticulously styled and blended that audiences never suspected. Off-screen, however, he was known to appear without it among friends, as if the performance stopped when the cameras did. But when the lights came on, the toupee was back in place, like the badge on a sheriff's chest. The irony, of course, is almost cinematic. The man who made a career out of authenticity, of raw, dust-covered realism, wore one of the most artificial tools in showbiz. And no one cared. Because when John Wayne looked you in the eye, wig or not, you believed every damn word. Bette Davis, hairlines and headlines. Bette Davis didn't just enter a room, she seized it. Her voice could cut glass, her eyes could stop a man mid-step, and her screen presence was volcanic. She wasn't about softness or sweetness. She played women with teeth, backbone, and a burning will to be seen. But as the years went on, and the lights stayed just as bright, the cracks began to show. And not just in the script. By the time Bette hit her 40s, practically ancient by Golden Age standards, Hollywood was already hunting for her replacement. And in an industry obsessed with youth, aging wasn't just a fear, it was a fight. Bette, ever the warrior, came armed. She turned to wigs and hairpieces, not to disguise herself, but to control the narrative. You see, with Bette Davis, it was never about pretending to be something she wasn't. It was about making sure you looked exactly where she wanted you to. Her wigs were sharp, precise, often dramatic, not hiding time, but confronting it. She wore them like armor, knowing full well the tabloid vultures were circling, waiting for a photograph to prove she was past her prime. They never got it, because Bette was always 10 steps ahead, on screen, in the press, and yes, even in the makeup chair. In the end, the wig wasn't the deception, it was the strategy. And no one played the long game like Bette Davis. Dean Martin, cool hair, cooler secrets. Dean Martin never looked like he was trying, and that was the trick. The voice was liquid, the smile permanent, and the tuxedo always perfect. Whether crooning beside Sinatra or cracking wise in a Rat Pack roast, Dean gave off the air of a man who had it all, effortlessly. But even smooth operators have secrets, and in Dean's case, the truth was hiding just above the grin. Martin began losing his hair relatively early, though you'd never guess it from the photos. His hair, always slick, always immaculate, became one of his trademarks. But that polished wave was no longer nature's gift. As his hair thinned, his team brought in Hollywood's quiet fixers, custom toupees, featherlight, and precision style to maintain the illusion. And for Dean, illusion was everything. But here's what made it genius. He never made a big deal. No drama, no cover-up scandals. Just a subtle swap from scalp to stage. The toupee wasn't a lie. It was a continuation of a character. Dean Martin, the impossibly cool crooner, simply had great hair. Why would anyone question it? In private circles, it was an open secret. But no one cared, because Dean made you want the illusion. He made it look like confidence, not camouflage. That's the magic of real star power. Because when Dean Martin walked into a room, nobody looked at the hairline. They were too busy watching the man float across the floor. Rita Hayworth, the hairline that Hollywood rewrote. Rita Hayworth was the dream. She didn't enter the room. She glowed in it. With lips like red silk and a waterfall of copper curls cascading over her shoulders, she became the fantasy of the 1940s, a living pinup, a cinematic siren. But the woman born Margarita Cancino didn't rise to stardom untouched. She was remade, strand by strand, until the girl from the Bronx vanished behind the glamour. Her iconic red hair wasn't natural. It was dyed, bleached, curled, and sculpted into submission. But the transformation didn't stop there. In one of the most extreme examples of Hollywood image control, studio executives ordered her natural low, Spanish hairline raised, with electrolysis. Painful, permanent. Over time, the repeated sessions thinned her hair so severely that wigs and hairpieces became part of her daily costume, long before they were needed for aging or illness. Rita never made a spectacle of it. She smiled for the cameras, her shimmering hair always just right. But beneath that iconic silhouette was a story not of vanity, but of sacrifice. She wasn't hiding a flaw, she was wearing the price of fame. Even decades later, when asked about her transformation, Rita said quietly, "Men go to bed with Gilda, but they wake up with me." The illusion was never just for the screen, it was expected to follow her home. Because in Rita Hayworth's Hollywood, beauty wasn't just manufactured, it was carved, painted, and sometimes burned into you. Fred Astaire, the dancer who couldn't outstep time. Fred Astaire moved like no one else. He didn't just dance, he floated, as if the world bent gently beneath his feet to let him pass. Every motion was precise, effortless, otherworldly. He made rhythm look like instinct. But while his feet defied time, his hair couldn't. Astaire began balding early in his career, long before he became a Hollywood legend. He knew the camera was unforgiving, especially under the searing lights of 1930 sets, where the lens magnified every shadow, every imperfection. So quietly, carefully, Fred Astaire began wearing hairpieces, not for drama, but for continuity. His toupees weren't bold or showy. They were subdued, delicate, an extension of his image, clean, classic, controlled. He treated his hair like he treated his choreography, obsessively, precisely. Stylists recall how he would rehearse with a toupee pinned in place, ensuring it never shifted, even during the most demanding routines. Because to Fred, performance was sacred. The illusion had to be seamless, whether it was a tap sequence or the hair above his brow. Yet there was something honest in his deception. He never pretended to be more youthful than he was. He didn't chase the vanity of youth, only the clarity of his silhouette, the grace of a finished picture. He was aging in motion, not hiding, just refining. Because for Fred Astaire, it wasn't about fooling you. It was about never letting the illusion fall out of step. Joan Crawford, steel under curls. Joan Crawford wasn't born, she was forged. Studio-fueled, self-made, and diamond-hard beneath layers of satin and lipstick, she wasn't just a movie star. She was a blueprint for fame itself. Her cheekbones could cut glass, her eyes could freeze a man in place, and her voice, low and deliberate, carried the weight of a woman who had earned her power. Every angle, every expression, every strand of hair, crafted. And the hair? That too was a battleground. As Crawford aged, her hair began to thin, and so did the patience of a youth-obsessed industry. But Joan didn't retreat. She built a fortress of wigs and hairpieces, perfectly coiffed, meticulously chosen, and always in service of the legend. No disarray, no flyaways, no doubt. Her wigs were structured like her roles, strong, controlled, iconic. She wore them not just for beauty, but for consistency. Crawford understood the power of silhouette, how the public needed to see the same version of her again and again. So she gave it to them every time. In public appearances, on screen, even in photographs released to the press, the hair never faltered. It was Joan Crawford, exactly as expected. But behind that immovable image was a woman who refused to let time or scrutiny define her. The wigs weren't weakness, they were discipline. Because Joan didn't wear wigs to hide. She wore them to remain untouchable. Tony Curtis, the pretty boy's quiet disguise. Tony Curtis had a face sculpted for the screen, sharp jaw, dreamy eyes, and hair so perfect it looked poured from a mold. He was the heartthrob of the 1950s, the fast-talking charmer with just enough edge to make you believe he was dangerous under the smile. But behind the confident grin and slick pompadour was a truth he shared with many leading men of his era. Time doesn't pause, not even for the beautiful. As the years passed and roles changed, Curtis began losing what had once been his signature, that full, raven black hair. And while some might have faded quietly from the spotlight, he refused to be erased by a hairline. Toupees became part of his on-camera persona, subtle, sleek, and nearly invisible. They weren't worn to deceive, they were worn to remain. Hollywood may have loved him for how he looked, but Curtis was determined to stay relevant long after the studio system stopped returning calls. What's most telling is how gracefully he accepted the shift. He never made a spectacle of it, never turned his wigs into tabloid drama. For a man once chased by screaming fans and cast for his looks more than his lines, wearing a toupee wasn't vanity, it was adaptation. And it worked. The charm never faded, because Curtis knew that charm isn't grown on a scalp, it's owned in the eyes. Because when the pretty boy became the seasoned star, he wore the illusion like a second skin, and never let it wear him. Marlene Dietrich, wigs, war paint, and willpower. Marlene Dietrich didn't just command the screen, she haunted it. With a gaze like frost and lips drawn in perfect defiance, she wasn't merely a woman, she was myth. Velvet shadows followed her, cigarette smoke curled, as if choreographed. But behind the cheekbones and mystery, Dietrich was an architect of her own legend, and every piece of it, including her hair, was chosen with military precision. Dietrich wore wigs not as a cover, but as costume, weapon, and signature. Platinum, sculpted, untouched by wind or time, her hair was never an accident. Whether stepping onto a film set or into a war zone to sing for troops, she was always composed, her image unshaken. And as she aged with grace, but never surrender, her wigs only grew more precise. They weren't there to fool you, they were there to remind you. You're looking at Marlene Dietrich. She treated beauty like a battlefield, and her hairpieces were part of the uniform. Custom-made, immovable, commanding. Even in her 70s, she could enter a room in a floor-length gown and diamonds, her wig styled as if not a single year had passed since Shanghai Express. It wasn't about denying age, it was about defying expectation. Dietrich didn't hide behind artifice, she declared it. Because to her, illusion wasn't deception. It was discipline, power, theater, and above all, a performance worth believing in. Clark Gable, the king's crown wasn't his. Clark Gable wasn't just a leading man, he was the leading man. Square-jawed, swaggering, impossibly sure of himself, he became the masculine ideal for generations. Rhett Butler didn't give a damn, and neither, it seemed, did Gable. But beneath that signature smirk and polished bravado was a quiet truth. The king of Hollywood wore a crown that wasn't entirely his. Gable began losing his hair in his 30s, during the height of his fame. And in an era where a man's virility was measured by everything from his voice to his hairline, going bald wasn't just a personal inconvenience, it was a professional threat. The studios stepped in, commissioning custom toupees so natural, so tailored, they became part of his persona. On screen, he never missed a beat. The mustache stayed, the charm never dipped, in the hair, always perfectly in place. But what made Gable unique was his approach. There was no sense of panic, no desperate clinging to youth. He wore his hairpieces like he wore a well-cut suit, functional, flattering, and never discussed. The illusion was maintained not out of fear, but out of respect for the image he had built. He wasn't hiding something shameful. He was upholding something iconic. Because when you're the king of Hollywood, you don't ask the audience to believe, you make sure they never think to question it in the first place. Vivien Leigh, a crown too heavy to hold. Vivien Leigh was lightning caught in lace. Her portrayal of Scarlett O'Hara burned into film history, fierce, fragile, unforgettable. Audiences saw the porcelain skin, the emerald eyes, the voice that could cut or caress in the same breath. She seemed untouchable, but beneath the flawless exterior was a woman waging quiet wars, and among the casualties was her hair. Leigh battled severe health struggles throughout her life, both physical and emotional. The strain of illness, the weight of expectation, and the brutal schedules of the studio system took their toll. Her once lustrous hair began to thin, then fall. But like any great actress, she understood the role had to go on, and so the wigs came in. Not elaborate, not theatrical, but delicate reconstructions of what the world believed she still had. Her hairpieces were part performance, part protection. They weren't worn to reclaim vanity, but to preserve control. For Vivien, control was everything, over the image, over the perception, over the distance between her pain and the audience's applause. The wig sat lightly on her head but heavily on her soul, a quiet reminder that the crown she wore, both on screen and off, came at a cost. She once said, "I have a hard time separating life from a stage." And perhaps that's the truth of her legacy. Not that she wore a wig, but that she wore the weight of being Vivien Leigh. Yul Brynner, the bald icon, with a secret past. Yul Brynner didn't just shave his head, he weaponized it. The moment he stepped onto the stage as the King of Siam, bald and unbothered, he shattered Hollywood's rules about beauty and masculinity. His smooth scalp became a signature, a bold rejection of vanity in an era obsessed with lush hairlines and studio polish. But what most people never realized is, Brynner didn't start bald, and he didn't choose it simply for style. In his early days, long before The King and I, Brynner had a full head of hair, dark, thick, and classically styled. But as he began to lose it, slowly and unevenly, he made a decision that would redefine his image. He shaved it all off. What began as a practical move to hide a patchy hairline became an act of total reinvention. Instead of concealing the change with wigs or toupees like so many of his peers, he leaned into it, hard. And it worked. Brynner's baldness became a brand. Audiences didn't see absence, they saw confidence, power, mystery. Few knew that the decision was born not from creative boldness, but from necessity. And he never corrected the myth. Because in Hollywood, the truth doesn't have to be said, it just has to be well lit. Yul Brynner turned a hair loss problem into a crown of defiance. Because sometimes the best way to keep a secret is to make it iconic. Lana Turner, bombshell by design. Lana Turner didn't stumble into stardom. She became it, meticulously and unapologetically. From the moment she was discovered at a soda fountain, she was transformed into a cinematic ideal, the blonde bombshell with flawless skin, perfect curves, and hair like spun gold. But the truth behind that golden halo? It was as manufactured as the dream she came to represent. Turner's natural hair was darker, coarser, and never quite camera-ready by Hollywood's impossible standards. Years of bleaching, curling, and overstyling, all done to maintain her bombshell image, took a toll. By the time she was in her 30s, her real hair was fragile, brittle, and increasingly unreliable under the brutal heat of set lights. The solution was simple, silent, and studio-approved: wigs. And not just any wigs, custom-crafted masterpieces. Turner's hairpieces were made to move, to glisten, to frame her face like a spotlight. Each one was styled to the millimeter, ensuring the image never cracked. She wore them with the same poise she wore her gowns, not to hide, but to maintain control over the fantasy the world demanded. Turner once said, "A successful coif can launch a career." She wasn't joking. In a system built on illusion, she played her part to perfection, not just with talent, but with precision. Because Lana Turner knew that stardom wasn't about being real, it was about being unforgettable, right down to the very last strand. George Burns, the laugh beneath the lining. George Burns aged in public, and he did it with a cigar in one hand, a punchline in the other, and a toupee that was in on the joke. With his signature round glasses and gravelly delivery, Burns made a career out of playing the wisecracking everyman, the guy who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed. But there was one thing he never joked about too loudly: the top of his head. Burns wore a toupee for most of his adult life, long before his hairline became a casualty of time. But unlike his contemporaries, he didn't treat it like a secret. He treated it like a prop, another tool in the comedy kit. Sometimes he'd poke fun at it, sometimes he'd ignore it completely. That was his brilliance. He didn't try to fool the audience. He distracted them with charm until it didn't matter. As he grew older and his fame transformed from film star to national treasure, the toupee stayed, never flashy, never fussy. It wasn't an attempt to reclaim youth, just to hold onto the silhouette people recognized and loved. The man changed, but the image? That stayed steady like the punchlines. He always delivered just a beat behind the smirk. Because George Burns understood something most stars never did. You can lose your hair, but if you keep your timing, you'll never lose the room. Hedy Lamarr, beauty, brilliance, and the hair that had to keep up. Hedy Lamarr was once called the most beautiful woman in the world, a title that clung to her like perfume. On screen, she was hypnotic, poised, flawless, and impossibly composed. But while audiences were transfixed by her face, few realized they were also witnessing one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century, a woman who co-invented technology that would one day power Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But even brilliance in Hollywood came second to appearance. Behind the luminous skin and the iconic dark waves was a constant effort to maintain the image. Lamar's natural hair was fine and prone to breakage, especially after years of relentless styling, chemical treatments, and overexposure to harsh lighting. As her film roles demanded perfection from every angle, wigs and hairpieces became a practical necessity. But for Lamarr, they were more than that. They were a kind of camouflage. She was a woman who often felt misunderstood, praised for beauty she didn't value, and ignored for intellect she desperately wanted to share. The wigs became part of the facade, not a lie, but a tool. They allowed her to move through a world that wanted her to be a silent painting, while inside, gears were always turning. Hedy Lamarr wore wigs the way others wore masks, not to deceive, but to protect. Because when the world only sees your face, sometimes you need to hide your truth, even in plain sight. William Holden, the leading man who quietly let go. William Holden never needed to shout. He didn't chase the camera, it came to him. With a natural intensity and a subtle kind of masculinity, he was the kind of actor who did more with a look than most could do with a monologue. From Sunset Boulevard to Stalag 17, he played men caught between charm and weariness, power and pain. And as the years passed, so too did the image, quietly, gracefully, and like his hairline, just out of sight. Holden's hair began to thin in the later stages of his career. But unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't dramatize it. He didn't hide from the truth. He just softened it. Toupees and subtle hairpieces became part of his on-screen toolkit, never bold enough to distract, but just enough to preserve continuity. For Holden, it wasn't about reclaiming youth, it was about preserving presence. And presence was everything. He didn't use wigs to reinvent himself or mask decline. He used them to allow the audience to keep seeing him the way they always had, even if he no longer did. His performances deepened with time, and so did his understanding of illusion. He never clung to it, he managed it like an actor hitting his mark without making a sound. Because William Holden understood what so many didn't. Fading gracefully doesn't mean disappearing. It means knowing when to step into shadow and when to let the light do the rest. Mae West, the wig was just the beginning. Mae West didn't walk into Hollywood. She sauntered in, rhinestoned and unbothered, hips swaying, eyes daring you to blink. She wasn't a starlet molded by the system. She was the one who broke the mold. With her sultry drawl, double entendres, and unshakable confidence, Mae West crafted an identity so powerful it eclipsed reality. And right at the heart of that persona, quite literally on her head, was the wig. The platinum curls, piled high and always just so, weren't a phase. They were her uniform. Mae wore wigs long before time or age required it. For her, the wig wasn't camouflage, it was command. It allowed her to transform instantly into the woman the world expected. Larger than life, untouchable, timeless. Even in her 70s, she played seductresses decades younger, her wigs as unbothered by age as she claimed to be. She didn't hide behind them, she made them iconic. The wigs were part of her mythology, styled as meticulously as her one-liners. No one ever saw Mae West without her hairpieces, and she made sure they didn't want to. The fantasy was everything, and the moment it cracked, the spell would break. She never let it. Because for Mae West, the wig wasn't a secret, it was a crown. And she wore it like she ruled the world. Jack Benny, the punchline, wore a hairpiece. Jack Benny was the master of the pause, the silence between the setup, and the punchline that somehow said more than words ever could. With a fiddle in one hand and a deadpan expression in the other, he built a comedy empire out of understatement. And when it came to his hair, or rather, the idea of his hair, Benny knew exactly how to play it. Yes, he wore a toupee. And yes, he knew you knew. In fact, he was probably 3 jokes ahead of you. Benny didn't try to hide it behind closed doors or dramatic stylings. He leaned into it, gently, strategically. It became part of the character, the vain, aging tightwad who clung to his hairpiece like his last dollar. It was a prop, a punchline, and at the same time, a piece of continuity in the character he perfected over decades. But make no mistake, while the audience laughed, the man behind the persona was always in control. Jack Benny's toupee wasn't an act of insecurity, it was an instrument. One he played as skillfully as a violin. It gave him just one more thing to mock, to wink at, to turn into comedy gold. Because Jack Benny understood something few did. If you turn your flaw into the joke, nobody can use it against you, and you always get the last laugh. Katharine Hepburn, elegance with edges and ends. Katharine Hepburn wasn't like the others, she never wanted to be. Sharp-tongued, high-collared, and defiantly herself, she wore slacks when studios demanded skirts, spoke her mind when silence was safer, and forged a career on her terms. She built her legacy on truth, the truth in her voice, in her performances, in her presence. But even the most authentic legends sometimes reach for illusion when the lights demand it. In her later years, Hepburn's hair began to thin. It was no scandal, no whispered rumor. It was simply part of time, a natural process that even icons aren't immune to. But Hollywood, with its hunger for perfection and continuity, doesn't always make room for nature. So, quietly, without drama or spectacle, Hepburn began to use wigs. Not to pretend, not to fool, but to maintain the integrity of the character, the silhouette the audience had come to know. Her hairpieces were never extravagant, never vain. They were utilitarian, elegant, almost invisible, much like her style itself. To see Katharine Hepburn on screen was to believe in presence, strong, clear, and unflinching. Whether in The Lion in Winter or her later interviews, she carried herself with the same fire, even if a few strands of it were clipped in place. Because Hepburn never needed to shout to be seen. And if a wig helped the world keep seeing her clearly, then it was just one more choice she made without apology. Victor Mature, the leading man with the quiet cover. Victor Mature looked like he was sculpted out of marble and dipped in bronze. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep voice and movie poster jawline, he was built for epics, Samson and Delilah, The Robe, Demetrius, and The Gladiators. He wore the toga well. But even a physique like his couldn't stop the slow, steady drift of time, especially at the hairline. Mature began losing his hair early, not dramatically, but persistently. And in an era when studios demanded consistency from their stars, a thinning crown could mean a thinning career. So Mature, never one for fuss, turned to a simple solution, the toupee. Well-fitted, never flashy, it did its job, and that's all he expected of it. He didn't hide it with drama. He didn't flaunt it either. Much like his attitude toward stardom itself, Mature treated his hairpiece as a professional tool. He once famously joked, "I'm not an actor, and I've got 64 pictures to prove it." There was no pretense, no ego in the fix. Just a man showing up for the part, ready to do the work, wig on and all. There's something refreshingly honest in that. Victor Mature didn't try to be perfect, he just tried to look like the man people paid to see. And in Hollywood, sometimes that quiet cover is the difference between fading out and finishing strong. Because in the end, the illusion only mattered if it helped the story, and Victor Mature always knew where he stood in the frame. Hollywood has always been a place where illusion meets ambition, where a well-lit angle or a perfectly styled wig can help turn a mortal into a legend. The stars we've just revisited weren't hiding out of shame. They weren't pretending to be something they weren't. They were preserving a moment, a character, a standard that the industry and the public demanded of them. Behind every toupee or wig was a deeper truth: vulnerability, professionalism, self-preservation, and above all, commitment to the craft. These icons knew that cinema was bigger than reality, and they played their parts right down to the very last strand. In many ways, their wigs were symbols of survival, of navigating a business that gave everything and took just as much. These stars aged, struggled, adapted, and endured, and their legacies remain untouched by what was real and what was carefully constructed. Because when the lights fade and the curtains close, what remains isn't whether the hair was theirs, it's how they made us believe it was.